Nevertheless, Sergeant Cunningham felt confident enough to conclude his diary entry for the 12th of March, making a beautiful passage so far for the Falkland Islands. That reassuring entry was followed by a very different one. 13th Sunday, such a one as I hope I may never spend again. With a strengthening wind, Erebus was still making 7 knots when, just before 1 a.m., James Angeli, the man at the foretop, shouted a warning from 100 feet above them. "All hands on deck," was sounded. Men asleep in their hammocks were roused and turned out half naked and utterly confused. Among them was John Davis. "I was in bed and on the sick list with my hand," he later wrote. "I'd been awoken by the noise of reefing topsails and lay awake listening. I knew something must be wrong by the constant commands to the helmsman. At last someone regularly screamed down the fore hatchway, 'All hands bear a hand on deck, every one!' And immediately after came a crash. 'Good God,' cried I, 'we're foul of an iceberg.' Things now happened very fast. Ross heaved his ship over to port to avoid being crushed, only to find that HMS Terror, under topsail and foresails, had heaved to starboard and was bearing down on them. There was no chance of her avoiding both the iceberg and Erebus. A collision was inevitable. On board Terror, John Davis recalled what happened next. "I opened my door to prevent it being jammed and hurriedly put on 2 or 3 articles of dress and jumped up the hatchway, fully expecting to see the cliff of an iceberg over our heads. Instead of which, just abreast the gangway, were the bows of the Erebus, as far as a copper above our gunwale, her fore-topmast and her bowsprit gone. Down we came, crash, with a shock that nearly knocked me down." Captain Ross described the moment of impact. "The concussion when she struck us was such as to throw almost everyone off his feet. Our bowsprit, topmast, and other small spars were carried away, and the ships, hanging together, entangled by the rigging, and dashing against each other with fearful violence, were falling down upon the weather face of the lofty berg, against which the waves were breaking and foaming to near the summit of its perpendicular cliffs. Sometimes she rose high above us, almost exposing her keel to view, and again descended as we in our turn rose to the top of the wave, threatening to bring her beneath us, whilst the crashing of the breaking upper works and boats increased the horror of the scene." In trying to avoid the iceberg, the ships had been put on a collision course, and these 2 stout vessels, which had survived everything nature could throw at them, were now being repeatedly smashed against each other by the waves. On Erebus, Cornelius Sullivan watched in horror as Terror met his ship with sufficient force to drive her anchor deep into the 8-inch planking of the hull. Erebus's bowsprit snapped to atoms, her foretopmast, and all the booms, stays, and rigging were torn away. "At this moment," Sullivan recalled, "we poor pilgrims of the ocean thought it was our last in this life." From the vantage of Terror, Sergeant Cunningham described what happened next. "They then recoiled from one another for a moment, which was one of awful suspense to the poor half-naked beings that crowded these decks. She took us again then, on our main beam with a most terrible crash, nearly staving our side in, breaking our rubbing pieces right up and tearing the iron sheathing into ribbons." The 2 ships hung together for a few moments, before tearing apart again, cracking the masts and bringing spars crashing onto the deck. Then, in the midst of the chaos and disorder, Captain Crozier seized the moment to take Terror towards a frighteningly narrow gap in the advancing wall of ice. Recalling that agonizing moment for his sister, Davis described the thoughts that had run through his mind. "Emily, what were my fears? I was afraid to stand before a severe though merciful and just God. I was not fit to die. What would I not have given at that time for a single day to prepare myself for such an awful change? What thoughts passed in rapid succession through my brain! The events of a life passed in review before me in a few moments, and what had I to trust to, except mercy? Terror slipped through the gap by a hair's breadth. It wasn't apparent, though, whether Erebus would be as fortunate. Indeed, as Marine Sergeant Cunningham strained his eyes into the darkness behind him, it looked to be all over. We could see nothing of the poor Erebus. In fact, we could see no means how she could be saved. Erebus was in critical danger. The collision had almost completely disabled her, bringing down spars that had become entangled in the lower yards, preventing the crew from hoisting sail. Like Crozier, a few moments before, Ross had to think fast, and in his subsequent account of the expedition, he described in detail what happened next. The only way left to us to extract ourselves from this awful and appalling situation was by resorting to the hazardous expedient of the sternboard, the equivalent of putting the ship into reverse. The heavy rolling of the vessel and the probability of the mast giving way each time the lower yardarms struck against the cliffs, which were towering high above our mastheads, rendered a service of extreme danger to loose the mainsail. But no sooner was the order given than the daring spirit of the British seaman manifested itself. The men ran up the rigging with as much alacrity as on any ordinary occasion, and although more than once driven off the yard, they after a short time succeeded in loosing the sail. Amidst the roar of the wind and the sea, it was difficult both to hear and to execute the orders that were given, so that it was 3/4 of an hour before we could get the yards braced by and the main-tack hauled on board sharp aback, an expedient that perhaps had never before been resorted to by seamen in such weather. But it had the desired effect. The ship gathered sternway, plunging her stern into the sea, washing away the gig and the quarter-boats, and with her lower yardarms scraping the rugged face of the berg. No sooner had we cleared it than another was seen directly astern of us, against which we were running, and the difficulty now was to get the ship's head turned round and pointed fairly through between the two bergs, the breadth of the intervening space not exceeding 3 times her own breadth. This, however, we happily accomplished, and in a few minutes after getting before the wind, she dashed through a narrow channel between 2 perpendicular walls of ice, and the next moment we were in smooth water under its lee. Terror turned a blue light to indicate that she was safe. When he saw a similar blue light shining not far away, Cunningham knew his worst fears had proved unfounded, and that Erebus had made it too, which made every heart bound again with joy. Staring back into the darkness, they could see just how lucky an escape it had been for both ships. The iceberg was not a lone drifter, but part of a long and continuous chain, with no way through other than the narrow slit that had saved them from destruction. Sullivan had no doubt who was responsible for their survival. God Almighty, my friends, alone that saved us from a miserable death 3,000 miles from any land. Cunningham concurred. I must here say that it was a most wonderful interposition of divine providence that we were not all sent into the presence of our Maker. And Davis too. After daylight, and we had signalised the Erebus, I went to my cabin, and never did a sinner offer up to the throne of the Almighty more sincere thanks. When McCormick came to write up his account of this narrowest of escapes, his praise was directed closer to home. At such a perilous crisis, a captain's responsibility is surely not one to be envied. However, Captain Ross was quite equal to the emergency, and, folding his arms across his breast, as he stood like a statue on the after part of the quarterdeck, he calmly gave the order to loose the mainsail, his whole bearing, while lacking nothing in firmness, yet betrayed the all but despair with which he anxiously watched the result of this last and only expedient left to us. The sternboard manoeuvre that Ross and his crew executed in the most dire and dangerous situation would have been a great gamble at any time. It was this almighty risk, rather than the Almighty himself, that saved the lives of his men. Crozier had been equally cool on terror. The captain, when it was all over, said that he'd not the slightest idea what he did during the hour and how he got through, wrote Davis. But he went on to give a hint of what a terrifying experience it had been for those on board. Only one was running out of his senses, but 2 or 3 were crying. Signals exchanged between the 2 ships confirmed that Terror was not seriously damaged, and Erebus, safe now in the lee of the icebergs, already had men on deck clearing the broken spars and the shredded rigging, whilst others waited to replace them. A meteor shot across the sky.